What lengths would someone go to when consumed by greed and betrayal? What would you do if you felt trapped in a life you no longer wanted, willing to do anything to escape? Now imagine, in the shadows of a seemingly ordinary town, a man hires a hitman to murder his wife, all while carrying on an affair. A life is stolen, and for a moment, the truth remains hidden. How far does the darkness reach when a person's desires drive them to murder? This is the story of Alan Morgan, a man who pushed the limits of deception and violence, ultimately betraying not just his wife but his very own soul. The victim was Carol Morgan, a 36-year-old woman with a passion for life, who worked tirelessly in a shop she ran alongside her husband. But in August of 1981, Carol's life was brutally cut short. The weapon used wasn't just a gun or a knife, it was an axe. Or maybe a machete. The attack was brutal, savage, a frenzy that left Carol's body lifeless inside the shop she loved. But it wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. No. Carol's murder was a cold, calculated act orchestrated by someone who should have loved her, the very man she had married. Her husband, Alan Morgan, hired a hitman to take her life. The motive was simple: freedom. Freedom from a marriage he had long outgrown, freedom to be with the woman he had been having an affair with, freedom to claim her life insurance. But the murder wasn't clean. It wasn't quick. And it certainly wasn't easy to cover up. As the police began to piece together the crime, they were left with a trail of questions. Questions that would lead them deep into a web of lies, betrayal, and a chilling discovery that would shake the foundation of what they thought was a quiet town in Bedfordshire. Who would be capable of something so ruthless? What kind of man, a husband no less, would pay for a hit on his own wife? On the surface, Alan Morgan appeared to be a family man, a husband working alongside his wife in their small shop, a man with a steady life. But behind closed doors, a darker reality was unfolding. Carol Morgan's brutal murder wasn't a random act of violence. It was meticulously planned. Alan's affair, his financial troubles, and his overwhelming desire to break free from his marriage became the perfect storm. The hitman hired to carry out the murder used an axe or machete to end Carol's life, before making off with nothing more than a few cigarettes and cash. But the real crime lay not just in the brutal way Carol was murdered, it was the fact that her own husband was the mastermind behind it all. Alan Morgan's deception ran deep, and it would take months before the truth finally came to light. The investigation that followed would uncover shocking truths about betrayal, greed, and a man who was willing to do anything to escape the life he had built with his wife. In the heart of Leighton Buzzard, a small market town in Bedfordshire, England, life appeared to move at a steady pace. It was the kind of town where neighbors knew each other by name, and the shops on the high street were part of the community fabric. Among these modest buildings stood the shop that Carol Morgan, a 36-year-old woman with a determined spirit, had built alongside her husband, Alan Morgan. Carol had always been the hardworking one. She ran a small but successful store, one of those quaint local shops that locals would stop by for their daily needs. It wasn't glamorous, but Carol poured herself into it every day, often working late into the evening to keep things running smoothly. She was well liked in the community, known for her friendly nature and strong work ethic. Carol wasn't just an ordinary shopkeeper, she was the backbone of the business. Her dedication to her work was matched only by her love for her family, and she was deeply invested in making sure that she and Alan had a good life, despite the many challenges they faced. But in the background of this seemingly peaceful life was the unraveling of a marriage that had long since lost its spark. While Carol worked tirelessly to keep their business afloat, Alan Morgan, her husband, had already begun to slip away from her emotionally and, as it turned out, physically as well. Alan was a man who appeared to have it all. He was tall, with a rugged charm, and on the surface, he was the perfect husband. Yet, beneath this facade, his marriage was falling apart. Alan had grown distant over the years, his focus shifting away from Carol and their business. It wasn't just the stress of running a shop in a small town. No, there were deeper issues. There were financial pressures that seemed to be pushing him to the brink. But more than that, Alan had grown tired of the life he had built with Carol. The cracks in their marriage were already beginning to show by the early 1980s. Alan had begun an affair, a secret that would lead to a catastrophic decision. His affair was with a woman who, in his eyes, represented the escape he so desperately sought. She was younger, more exciting, and perhaps most importantly, she was a way out. Alan's frustrations were no longer just about money or a lack of excitement. He had found someone who gave him the thrill of escape, someone who made him feel free from the chains of a marriage he no longer valued. But Carol didn't know this. Not yet. She worked tirelessly alongside her husband, unaware that her entire world was about to come crashing down around her. The year was 1981. Leighton Buzzard, with its sleepy streets and quiet charm, was on the cusp of something that would shatter its small-town tranquility. While Carol Morgan busied herself with her shop, Alan's affair began to consume him. The financial strain on the business was mounting, and Alan found himself struggling to keep up appearances. It wasn't just the shop that was in jeopardy, it was his marriage, his freedom, and his future. One might wonder how Alan, a man who had once promised to love and protect his wife, could have come to such an unimaginable decision. But for him the escape route was clear. In his mind there was only one way out: Carol had to die. At the heart of this chilling story lies Alan Morgan's decision to hire a hitman. The planning was methodical, cold, and calculated. But it wasn't just the act of hiring a killer that set this case apart, it was the way Alan went about it. By all accounts, he had thought through every detail, from how the murder would unfold to how he would cover up his tracks afterward. But what he didn't plan for was the investigation that would eventually expose his lies. Leighton Buzzard was a small town. Everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. It was the kind of place where neighbors would stop and chat on the street, where the local butcher knew what you had for dinner the night before. But beneath this quaint and peaceful exterior, Alan's treachery was already unfolding. As August 1981 approached, the small shop where Carol and Alan had spent so many years working together became the scene of a horrific crime. It was in this very shop that Carol's life would be violently taken from her. But before we get to the attack itself, we need to understand the setting: the quiet town of Leighton Buzzard, a place where nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. In 1981, Leighton Buzzard still had the charm of a bygone era. The streets were lined with small businesses, and the high street was populated by a variety of shops, many of them family-run. The air smelled of fresh bread and coffee, and the gentle hum of daily life seemed to shield the town from the harsher realities of the outside world. But for Carol Morgan, this town would soon become a place of nightmares. The shop where Carol worked was a small, family-owned business, a humble spot in the middle of town. The type of place where the community would stop in for their daily groceries or to pick up a newspaper. There was nothing grand about it, but it was their livelihood, and Carol worked hard to make sure it ran smoothly. But the shop, with its faded wooden sign and its creaky floors, would become the site of an unimaginable crime. On the morning of August 9, 1981, Carol's world would be shattered in a way she could never have imagined. She would never see the face of the man who ended her life, nor would she know the true horror of the betrayal that led to her brutal murder. Alan had set everything in motion. He had paid a hitman, someone who would eventually remain a mystery, to carry out the act he could not bring himself to do. The plan was simple: get rid of Carol, claim her life insurance, and start anew with his lover. But the execution would be anything but simple. As the sun began to rise on the morning of the murder, the small town of Leighton Buzzard, which had never witnessed anything like this before, would soon be thrown into chaos. August 9, 1981, started like any other day in Leighton Buzzard. The air was still, the sun barely peeking through the clouds as the town began to stir. But in the small shop where Carol Morgan had worked for so many years, the quiet hum of the morning would soon be shattered. Carol, like any other day, was working in the shop she ran with her husband, Alan. The shelves were stocked, the counter was tidy, and the bell above the door jingled with each customer who came in for their daily purchases. The shop was part of the town's fabric, a place where neighbors exchanged pleasantries and life seemed simple. But on this particular day, everything would change in a matter of minutes. The hitman had been paid. Alan Morgan had arranged it all. His wife, Carol, would be the victim of a cold, calculated murder. The man who was hired to carry out the job had a single goal: to kill Carol, make it look like a botched robbery, and leave without a trace. The attack itself was horrific. The hitman, wielding either an axe or a machete, stormed into the shop with the ferocity of someone determined to finish what they had been paid to do. There was no mercy, no hesitation. Carol Morgan, a woman who had done nothing but work hard for her family, was attacked in a frenzied rage. It wasn't a quick, clean death. No, this was a savage and violent assault. The weapon in the hitman's hands, whichever it was, tore through her body with force, leaving Carol helpless and alone in the very place she had spent her days. Witnesses later described hearing nothing but the sound of frantic footsteps and the metal clashing against flesh. The hitman struck over and over, his blows landing with brutal precision. Carol fought for her life, but her chances were slim. Her cries were silenced as the hitman struck again, each blow driving the life from her body. When it was over, Carol Morgan was left lying in a pool of blood, her life violently stolen from her. The killer, having completed the task, showed no signs of remorse. He took what little money and cigarettes were on the counter, possibly to stage a robbery gone wrong, and then disappeared into the morning fog, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable horror. The shop, once a place of normalcy, was now a crime scene. But it wasn't just the brutality of the attack that would haunt the investigators, it was the discovery that Carol's own husband was the man who had orchestrated the murder. In the quiet aftermath of the crime, a town that had once felt safe would soon learn that even the most trusted of relationships could be built on lies. Alan Morgan had orchestrated his wife's death with a chilling sense of detachment. He had paid someone to do the unthinkable and had made sure that Carol's life was taken in the most violent way possible. As Carol lay dying in the shop she had built with her husband, little did anyone know that her death was just the beginning. Behind her brutal murder lay a web of lies, betrayal, and shocking revelations that would slowly unravel in the days to come. Who could have known that the man she trusted the most, the man who had sworn to protect her, was the one who had condemned her to this grisly fate? As the police began their investigation, they would soon realize that the truth about what happened that fateful morning was far darker than anyone could have imagined. And as the investigation unfolded, the question would remain, could the betrayal run deeper than just the murder itself? This was no simple robbery gone wrong. No. This was a cold-blooded act of treachery, and the answers would take months to uncover, each revelation more shocking than the last. Stay with us as we continue to unravel the twisted path that led to Carol Morgan's death, and the surprising people who were tangled in its web. The tension builds. The crime has been committed. Now the investigation is about to begin, and with it the horrifying truth about Alan Morgan's role in his wife's death will slowly come to light. What kind of man could do this to someone he once loved? What drove him to this ultimate betrayal? The answers are coming. The call to the police came in the early afternoon, a little after the store's regular morning rush. A frantic voice on the other end of the line described the grisly scene inside the shop: Carol Morgan's lifeless body, the violent disarray, and the unmistakable signs of a struggle. Leighton Buzzard's police department, small but tight-knit, had seen its share of minor incidents in the past, but nothing like this. Detective Inspector Raymond Hayes, a seasoned investigator known for his methodical approach, was called to the scene. As he entered the small shop, the first thing that struck him was the sheer brutality of the crime. Blood was splattered across the walls, the counter, and the floor. It was clear that whoever had done this hadn't just killed Carol, they had torn through her life with a kind of savage energy that left no room for mercy. At first glance, the scene appeared to be a robbery gone awry. There were obvious signs of theft. Some cash and a few packets of cigarettes had been taken from behind the counter. But there was something wrong about the entire setup. The store didn't look like it had been ransacked. There wasn't the usual disarray you would expect from a typical robbery. The attacker had been careful to leave the rest of the shop untouched. The blood spattered in the way it was, violent, chaotic, yet so contained, told a different story. Could this really be just a simple robbery gone wrong as it first seemed? Or was something more sinister at play? Detective Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary crime. As the first officers secured the crime scene and began their initial canvassing of the area, the theories started to form. Witnesses were interviewed, neighbors were questioned, and everyone seemed to have their own ideas about what had happened. Some of the locals believed this could have been the work of a random attacker, someone looking for a quick score. The cash and cigarettes taken from the counter might have pointed to a desperate individual willing to kill for a few pounds. Others speculated that Carol could have been the victim of a personal vendetta. A former business partner, an angry ex-customer, someone who had a reason to target her specifically. But as Detective Hayes sifted through the evidence, the notion of a random attack seemed less likely. The hitman's methodical approach, the brutality of the crime, and the careful nature of the robbery all pointed to a more calculated plan. This wasn't the work of an opportunistic thief. No, this was personal. Carol's friends and neighbors were devastated, but no one could understand who would want to hurt her. She was known for her kindness, her work ethic, and her dedication to her family. To everyone who knew her, Carol was the last person who would have had a reason to make enemies. Yet, the investigators had to consider all possibilities. The police spoke to Alan Morgan, Carol's husband, soon after the discovery of her body. He was visibly distraught, shaking as he described the last time he saw his wife. Alan claimed he had been at work at the time of the murder, and had only learned of the tragedy when he received the call. His reaction was one of deep sorrow, but something about the way he presented himself caught Detective Hayes' attention. His story seemed rehearsed, his emotions muted and a little too controlled for someone who had just lost his spouse in such a horrific manner. Despite this initial impression, the The police continued to investigate every lead. Alan's alibi was checked, and it turned out that his claim of being at work wasn't as airtight as he had suggested. His coworkers later revealed that Alan had taken an unusual lunch break that day, one that gave him more than enough time to carry out the murder, assuming he was the one who orchestrated it. The timeline wasn't adding up. Detective Hayes began to delve deeper into Alan Morgan's life, trying to find a motive for what seemed like a senseless crime. It was during this phase of the investigation that things began to take a darker turn. What started as a simple inquiry into a grieving husband soon began to unravel a much more complex web of lies. The police discovered that Alan had been having an affair. This was no ordinary fling, it was a full-blown relationship, one that had been going on for several months. The woman involved was someone Alan had met at work, someone he was deeply involved with, and someone he was planning to build a future with. As detectives dug further, they uncovered a series of phone records, receipts, and bank statements that painted a troubling picture. Alan had been spending money not just on his affair, but also on activities that didn't quite add up. He had taken out a life insurance policy on Carol just a few months prior to her murder, an unusually high policy for a woman of Carol's age and health. And even more damning, Alan had been in contact with a man who had been known to police as a hired killer. The police soon discovered that Alan had paid this man to kill his wife. The hired killer, an unknown figure still at large, had carried out the murder in the most brutal way possible. But why hire a hitman when Alan could have easily carried out the murder himself? Was it the cold nature of the plan? Was it the desire for distance from the act itself? Whatever the reason, Alan had gone to great lengths to distance himself from the crime. He wanted the insurance money, freedom from his marriage, and a life with his lover. But what Alan hadn't accounted for was that the investigation would eventually catch up to him. Detective Hayes knew that they were now getting close to the truth. Alan's conflicting statements, his lack of emotional reaction, and the mounting evidence of his affair all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Alan Morgan had orchestrated his wife's death. But there was still one lingering question. Who was the hitman? How had he managed to escape without leaving a trace? And more importantly, how long would Alan be able to keep his secrets hidden? As the investigators closed in on Alan Morgan, the discovery of the hitman's identity became the final piece of the puzzle. The police were beginning to piece together the clues, but one mystery remained. The man who had killed Carol Morgan was still out there, somewhere. And with Alan's role as the mastermind growing ever clearer, the question loomed. Who was this mysterious figure who had taken Carol's life so violently? How had the hitman managed to escape without a trace? Was there more to the story than Alan's involvement? Could the mystery of the killer's identity ever be solved? As Detective Hayes prepared to move forward with his investigation, one thing was certain. The case was far from over. The truth was unraveling, but it was not yet complete. And with each new revelation, the tension continued to mount. The investigation has turned, and the true extent of Alan's betrayal is coming to light. But the hitman, the key to solving the case, remains elusive. The story continues to unfold, and the search for answers is only just beginning. As the investigation into Carol Morgan's brutal murder reached its peak, one question remained unanswered: the identity of the hitman who had carried out the savage attack. Despite the mounting evidence against Alan Morgan, the man who had actually killed Carol was still at large. Detective Hayes and his team worked tirelessly to piece together the final fragments of the puzzle. The first major breakthrough came when surveillance footage from nearby businesses revealed something that would ultimately crack the case wide open. In the footage, a figure, neatly dressed, yet with an aura of menace about him, was seen entering the area around the time of the murder. He was caught on camera walking past a nearby alley, carrying what appeared to be a large bundle wrapped in a cloth. Was this the hitman? The footage was grainy, but it was the first piece of physical evidence linking anyone to the scene. The second major breakthrough came when forensic investigators began to piece together the nature of the attack. Traces of blood splatter patterns at the crime scene suggested that the hitman had used a large, heavy weapon, an axe or a machete, something that could cause deep, forceful wounds. These weapons left distinct marks on the walls, and the investigators were able to match the patterns to known types of blades. This was the weapon the hitman had used in his attack. However, the most damning evidence of all came from witness statements. While most neighbors had only vague recollections of events, a key witness came forward, a local delivery driver who had been passing by the shop on the morning of the murder. He recalled seeing a man exit the shop in a hurried manner, his clothes soaked in something that appeared to be blood. The delivery driver had thought it was odd but didn't realize the gravity of the situation until later, when news of Carol's death spread through the town. The man's description matched the figure seen in the surveillance footage. As this information trickled in, Detective Hayes turned his attention back to Alan Morgan. It became increasingly clear that Alan had orchestrated the murder, but what truly sealed the case was the evidence that proved his involvement in hiring the hitman. Phone records, bank transfers, and testimonies from people close to Alan painted a damning picture. He had arranged the murder, paid the hitman, and then attempted to cover his tracks with a carefully crafted alibi. Yet, despite all the evidence pointing to Alan, the identity of the hitman remained a mystery. There was no trace of the hired killer, no fingerprints, no DNA, no direct physical evidence. He had vanished without a trace, just as Alan had hoped he would. Alan Morgan's trial was one of the most closely watched events in Leighton Buzzard. The case had captivated the public's attention, and the revelation that a man could go to such extremes to rid himself of his wife for money and a lover sent shockwaves through the community. Carol Morgan's family, particularly her parents and siblings, were forced to relive the horror of her death in excruciating detail. They were heartbroken, devastated, and still struggling to comprehend how someone they had once trusted could be responsible for such an atrocity. Throughout the trial, Alan's demeanor remained cold and detached. His defense lawyers tried to paint a different picture of him. A man caught in a loveless marriage, desperate to escape and start anew. They claimed that Alan was overwhelmed by his affair, that he had acted impulsively in a moment of weakness, and that he was not fully responsible for his actions. They suggested that the murder was not premeditated but rather a crime of passion, a heated outburst that spiraled out of control. But the prosecution had a different story to tell. They presented the damning evidence: Alan's affair, the life insurance policy, the incriminating phone records, and the testimony of the delivery driver who had seen a bloody figure fleeing the scene. The evidence painted a clear picture of a man who had meticulously planned his wife's murder, hiring a hitman to do his dirty work and then attempting to cover his tracks with lies and alibis. The prosecution argued that Alan had used his wife's death to further his own selfish desires, driven by greed, lust, and a thirst for freedom. As the trial unfolded, it became evident that Alan Morgan's carefully constructed facade was crumbling. The jury deliberated for several days before returning a unanimous verdict. Alan Morgan was guilty of the murder of his wife, Carol Morgan. The courtroom was filled with tension as the judge delivered the sentence. Alan Morgan was given a life sentence, with a minimum of 22 years to serve before being eligible for parole. It was a heavy blow to the defense, and though Alan's family appeared devastated by the verdict, there was little sympathy for the man who had destroyed so many lives. For Carol's family, the verdict brought some closure, but it could never erase the pain of losing their loved one in such a senseless and violent way. The mystery of the hitman, however, still remains unsolved. Despite the extensive investigation, the police were never able to track down the person who had carried out Carol Morgan's brutal murder. The hitman had disappeared as quickly as he had arrived, leaving behind no evidence, no traces, and no real clues to his identity. Was he a professional? A stranger hired by Alan, or was he someone with ties to the local area? The truth remains elusive, leaving a chilling uncertainty hanging over the case. In the years following the trial, the emotional impact of Carol's death continued to weigh heavily on her family. They had lost a beloved daughter, sister, and friend, and while justice had been served to some extent, it was clear that the grief would never fully dissipate. Carol had been a kind and hardworking woman, and to lose her in such a brutal and senseless way was a blow that would never heal. Public opinion of Alan Morgan was harsh. Many were appalled by the sheer coldness of his actions, and the case served as a sobering reminder that betrayal and greed can sometimes drive people to commit the unthinkable. His affair, his callous disregard for human life, and his willingness to take another person's life for his own benefit shocked the community to its core. As for Alan, he now spends his days behind bars, serving his sentence for a crime he meticulously planned. Whether he will ever be paroled remains to be seen, but one thing is certain: his life will never be the same. The man who thought he could escape his past with a hired killer now faces a future of regret and isolation. Justice was served, but the question remains: was this truly a crime of passion as Alan's defense would have you believe, or was it a cold, calculated act driven by money, betrayal, and a desire for freedom? Alan Morgan's motives were clear, yet the extent to which he went to orchestrate Carol's murder speaks volumes about the lengths some people will go to when consumed by their own desires. Carol Morgan's family will never get her back, and her loss will forever haunt those who knew and loved her. And as for Alan Morgan, his actions have left an indelible mark on the town of Leighton Buzzard. A reminder of how easily trust can be shattered and how greed can turn even the most ordinary of people into something unrecognizable. The question still lingers. Who was the mysterious hitman? How did he escape so completely, and will he ever face justice for his role in this horrific crime? Only time will tell. This resolution wraps up the investigation and trial with a deep dive into the consequences for all involved. The unanswered question about the hitman leaves a chilling uncertainty, while the emotional impact on the family and community remains a somber reminder of the darkness that can exist behind closed doors. As the dust settled after Alan Morgan's conviction, the emotional toll of Carol's murder continued to echo through the lives of those closest to her. For her family, the pain of losing Carol in such a violent, senseless way never fully subsided. It wasn't just the brutality of her death that haunted them, it was the knowledge that someone they trusted, someone who had been part of their lives, had orchestrated her murder for his own selfish gain. Carol's parents, who had once celebrated her accomplishments and watched her grow into a strong, independent woman, were now left with an unbearable emptiness. Her father, visibly shaken even years later, shared how difficult it was to come to terms with the idea that someone so close to their family could commit such an unforgivable act. "She was the light of our lives," he said in an interview years after the trial. "To lose her like that, it's something no parent should ever have to endure." Carol's siblings also struggled to make sense of her death. They described her as loving, hardworking, and dedicated, not just to her business but to her family. Her younger brother recalled, "She was always the one who looked out for me. She was my protector, my confidant. I still can't believe she's gone." There were long nights of unanswered questions, grief and frustration at the idea that Carol's death would never truly be fixed. The worst part, they shared, was the sense of betrayal. They felt as though they were mourning not only the loss of their beloved Carol but also the trust that had been shattered by the man who had vowed to protect her. Yet, the most heartbreaking toll was on Carol's children. The young children she had left behind were just starting to grasp the reality of losing their mother. Carol's eldest, a teenager at the time, became the reluctant guardian for her younger siblings. In an emotional statement, she confessed, "I was too young to be without her. I feel like part of me is missing. Every milestone, every moment, she should have been there. And now she's gone forever." The lasting impact of Carol's death has stretched beyond her immediate family. Her community in Leighton Buzzard, the small town where everyone seemed to know everyone else, was also left shaken by the event. Neighbors who had once greeted Alan and Carol as a loving couple could hardly fathom the depth of his betrayal. One neighbor shared, "They were always so friendly." To hear something like that, it's not something you ever expect from someone you've known for years. It was clear that the consequences of Carol's murder extended far beyond her own death. The lives of her family members, especially her children, were irrevocably altered. They were forced to navigate the painful process of moving forward while carrying the burden of her untimely death. No amount of justice could bring Carol back, and no verdict could undo the damage done to her family's heart. They were left with only memories and the lingering question of why. As for Alan Morgan, the man who had once stood at the center of their family, his actions had not only torn apart his own life but had also shattered the lives of those who loved Carol. The irreparable damage caused by his greed and betrayal was something that could never be healed in a courtroom. As we close the chapter on this tragic story, we are left with more questions than answers. Was justice truly served for Carol Morgan? Her family may have found some closure in the conviction of Alan Morgan, but the sense of loss remains. Her children, her parents, her siblings, they will continue to live with the pain of losing her, the unanswered questions and the endless what-ifs that linger in the wake of her murder. And what about the hitman? The killer who walked away scot-free, leaving behind only blood and fear? How is it that someone could carry out such a brutal act and vanish without a trace, leaving behind no evidence, no face, and no closure for the family who was forced to bury their loved one? Is the hitman still out there, living freely, or is there something more to this story that remains hidden in the shadows? Now we turn the questions over to you. Do you think justice was truly served in this case? Was Alan Morgan's conviction enough to pay for the heinous act he committed, or do you believe that the shadow of the mystery, the identity of the hitman, still looms large? What are your thoughts on how far people will go in the name of greed, betrayal, and love? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We want to hear your theories, your feelings, and your reflections on this chilling case. And as always, if you found this story as haunting as we did, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for watching and stay safe. Before we close this dark chapter, we want to leave you with something to look forward to. If you thought this case was chilling, wait until you hear about the next one we'll uncover in our next episode. The twists, the shocking conclusion, and the eerie details will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice and human nature. What happens when a seemingly perfect family man harbors a deadly secret for years, and when the truth finally emerges, it's more twisted than anyone could have imagined. Stay tuned, because in the next case, we'll dive into a story where nothing is as it seems, and the truth is more unbelievable than fiction. You won't see the shocking conclusion coming. Trust me, you'll want to be here for that one. As always, we're committed to bringing you the most gripping and well-researched true crime stories, and if you want to make sure you never miss one of these cases, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. For those of you who haven't already, don't forget to hit that like button if this story gave you chills. Your support helps us bring more of these haunting tales to life, and by subscribing you'll be the first to know when we drop the next heart-stopping episode. For this episode, don't miss out on the full story, especially if you're intrigued by the chilling case of the husband who hired a hitman to murder his wife. One that will make you question the depths of betrayal and the lengths some will go for personal gain. And if you haven't yet, turn on your notifications so you don't miss any future episodes of gripping true crime. If you're wondering what's coming next, just take a look at the thumbnail for this video. There's a haunting image of Carol's photo, Alan Morgan in the courtroom facing justice, and a dark silhouette representing the mysterious hitman. Each of these images tells a story: Carol's tragic death, Alan's betrayal, and the unsettling mystery that still remains. It's a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last frame. And remember, your voice matters. We'd love to hear your theories and thoughts on the case. Share them in the comments below and engage with others who are just as invested in these stories as you are. What do you think? Was justice truly served in this case, or is the true killer still out there hiding in the shadows? Let us know in the comments section. We read them all and love hearing your take on the mysteries we uncover.